Let me start off with you. I mean, you've got inflation that's being driven essentially because of the FX effect. And as with a lot of other central banks, the BOE is also dealing with record low wage growth, just insipid wage growth. So what do they do, particularly as you'd imagine there's further pain for sterling as we get into the murky waters of Brexit negotiations?
Well, I think they probably should be sitting on their hands, as the majority were. The reality is that the fall in the exchange rate has been driven by Brexit. The economy certainly appears to be slowing. Let's just put this in context. If you look at the Q1 growth figure, the UK is the slowest growing country in the G7 and the slowest growing country in the EU 28. We have falling real wages, and after they made their decision, before it was announced, they got horrendous retail sales figures. So this reminds one of 2008. I remember, I think it was June and July 2008, and I voted for a cut. Somebody else voted for a rate rise, and the majority voted for nothing, and inflation was 5%. So the worry is that the minority didn't look through the short, sharp shock of inflation and worried about the long, dragging conditions coming from the slowing economy. But I think a rate rise would be a huge error right now.
And let's just show something,
and the
Danny,
next move is probably going to be a cut.
And let's show people why. Because as you just mentioned, retail sales, the worst report in a year, and of course, inflation surging. But inflation is acting as a tax on consumers. They can't spend as much. Look at this. We're showing hashtag BTV 9336. UK consumer spending overall is falling for the first time since 2013. This is pretty bad.
Yeah, and the reality was that the Bank of England made a cut in August, expecting that the consumer would kind of pull back. The surprise was that the consumer started to spend again and was dissaving, but that really couldn't go on for very long, and then all of a sudden you start to see falling real wages. So I suspect what you're going to see in Q2 and Q3 will be more falling consumption and a slowing economy, and if the bank were to raise rates, that would slow the economy further. And the worry for the markets is that basically the UK doesn't have a credible government right now, doesn't have a credible fiscal policy. I mean, how could they actually pass anything in the Parliament? So the responsibility rests on the central bank to try and calm nerves. Raising rates would actually be obviously a big mistake.
Well, Danny, when you talk about the lack of a credible government, this has a lot to do, of course, with Theresa May's recent failure at the polls to increase her majority in Parliament. Now her ratings are down. All kinds of things are hitting this. But I want to show one more chart to talk about the economy, because it's very possible that what's happening to the UK consumer and economy is one of the reasons she suffered at the polls. This is hashtag BTV 6094, just showing how, as you see prices rising, we've got a white line that shows the UK CPI and a turquoise line showing wages. So it's not only that wages have fallen, inflation is rising, making real wages fall even faster. Is this one of the things that's eating away at Theresa May's popularity, her ability to govern from a position of strength?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on there. If you look at what's happened in the US, real wages have actually risen since 2008. To put this in reality, real wages today are still about 4% below what they were in 2008. They picked up in 2015 and 16, but at the start of 2017, they turned into reverse. So people are still worse off than they were in 08, but have seen a decline in their purchasing power. I think that fall in real wages is probably the prime determinant of what happened to Theresa May. She was a terrible candidate, but I think people were hurting, and all she offered was more of the same. And after 7 years or so, people have said, enough's enough. So I think the reality is, you're completely right. Real wages were the driving force, and I see no likelihood for any time soon that that's going to change. Real wages are going to continue to fall, and that's a big problem for May.
You know, Danny, since we're talking about May and the struggles, that's an understatement here with Theresa May and what happened after the vote.
Sure.
What do you think is going to happen with Brexit?
Well, it was really interesting in the sense that the election, in many senses, was called about Brexit, but Brexit really wasn't front and centre in the in the campaign.
Right.
My suspicion is that the hard Brexit, the support that was there for hard Brexit, that in a sense she was looking to gain in the sort of sudden election, has kind of gone. Presumably the Macron and the other European leaders realise that really she has a very weak bargaining hand. So the question,
Right.
it seems to me, is and you may well have another election. I think this hard Brexit has gone. Her bargaining position is much weaker than it was. All bets are off. We don't really know, and we don't really know if she can actually pass a Queen's speech.
But do you think it could get scrapped?
Well, I think I think there's every likelihood we'll see a softer landing. We may well see, a deal probably closer to Switzerland and Norway. And you've suddenly seen that Nigel Farage suddenly realises that maybe Brexit is going to get scrapped, and maybe all the things that he's worked for are going to get removed. I would not be the slightest bit surprised, especially with the stuff that's going on in Ireland, where there has to be a renegotiation of the peace treaty, where the British are supposed to be neutral player. That's going to be a big problem. So I think the whole of the Brexit strategy now is really on hold.
Well, Danny,
and I wouldn't be surprised. Sorry.
In terms of Theresa May's future, I mean, the Brexit negotiations are supposed to start on June 19th regardless. But meanwhile, it seems like she's just kind of sliding down a slippery slope of political unpopularity, becomes some of the big events that have hit the UK people so hard. The apartment building fire, the Manchester attack, are actually also weighing on her standing with the British public.
Well, I've just seen the latest approval rating, and now all of a sudden, Jeremy Corbyn has moved to +6. And Theresa May is at -32. And what happened in the last 24 hours was that Corbyn went to the part of London where that fire was and was talking to all the people. May went there, and she was kept away from talking to ordinary people, and that was not received well in the newspaper. So her standing has really diminished. Her ability to really run a government now looks to be seriously in question. I mean, the ex-chancellor George Osborne called her a dead woman walking. And that may be right.
Danny, I've got an existential question for central bankers for you. Are we looking at inflation in the right way in terms of, do we need to change the way we look at price pressures? And is this lack of inflation everywhere, basically, other than what the BOE is dealing with, because of structural secular changes, automation, technology and all the rest of it replacing ageing workers?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I signed up this week to what's called Fed Up, if you like, a group of economists, including Joe Stiglitz and Narayana Kocherlakota, arguing that the Fed should raise its inflation target. And at the press conference, Janet Yellen was asked about it and seemed pretty seemed to think it was quite a good idea. I mean, the reality is that the Fed's basically been raising rates, inflation below target. If you had a higher target, the obvious thing you'd be doing is stimulating longer. I think there's certainly an argument to say that we should perhaps think about raising the target. I think it's going to be an issue in the US. There's nothing, I mean, we got 2%, but why 2 rather than 2.5? The Bank of England's target was actually changed once by Gordon Brown, and the Fed looks at what it's targeting every 5 years, and I think it set this in 2012. So I think the likelihood is people are going to think about it. There's nothing especially magic about 2, and I think a higher target would be a good idea. And I signed up to the letter that's been circulating this week.